History remembers tyrants, it remembers warriors, conquerors, madmen, and geniuses. It has seen emperors who burned cities, sultans who built empires, and kings who drowned nations in chaos. But among all the shadows that stretch across Europe's past, one figure stands apart, not because he was great, not because he was brilliant, not because he left behind triumphs, but because he embodied something else entirely: decay, cruelty, corruption, and a twisted excess so deep that it reshaped the destiny of an entire country. His name was Ferdinand VII of Spain, the monarch whom many historians still call the worst king Europe ever had. The shame of the Bourbon dynasty, one of the most degenerate rulers in history. He was a leader driven not by duty, nor justice, nor vision, but by revenge, paranoia, and impulses he could not control. Under his reign, Spain collapsed economically. Colonies across the Atlantic broke free. Civil conflict simmered beneath the surface, and corruption devoured the court like a living plague. But the darkest part of his legacy was not political, it was personal. Inside the palace, behind velvet curtains and gilded doors, Ferdinand VII constructed a world of private obsessions, a world where intimacy became a tool of dominance, humiliation became entertainment, and the king's own declining health clashed with his unchecked cravings. Servants whispered about hidden rooms. Diplomats wrote reports they dared not circulate. Doctors described situations so embarrassing they masked them with coded language. And every queen who married him discovered the same truth. To be the wife of Ferdinand VII was not to be a consort, but a captive. This is not just the story of a king, it is the story of a man shaped by bitterness, consumed by fixation, and capable of turning his nation into a reflection of his own corruption. A ruler who caused destruction through his private life more effectively than others did through their armies. A monarch whose personal conduct was so extreme, so unsettling, so relentlessly grotesque, that it overshadowed his entire reign. This is the story of the sovereign history tried to bury, and the darkness he left behind. The king's dark pleasures, inside the hidden indulgences of Ferdinand VII. Ferdinand VII ruled Spain with an iron fist in public, but in private he governed something even more troubling: his private chambers, his impulses, his secret rooms, his fixations. And in these concealed spaces, far from ministers, soldiers, ambassadors, and the eye of the church, the king became something entirely different. Not a monarch, but a man overtaken by urges he refused to restrain. This chapter takes us into the restricted rooms, the whispered rumors, and the documented scandals of Ferdinand VII's private universe, a world where authority, degradation, and forbidden fantasies intertwined. A kingdom behind closed doors. To understand Ferdinand's hidden obsessions, you must first understand the world that shaped him. He grew up watching. His mother belittle his father, her favorite advisor, Godoy, dominate the country, the court ridicule him behind his back, and the empire fall apart while he remained powerless. So when he finally rose to the throne, he clung to the only territory he could completely command: the sphere of personal intimacy, his own and that of those around him. The palace overflowed with ministers. The state was split into factions. Spain itself slipped from his grasp, but inside the bedchamber, there no one dared challenge him. No one could restrict him. No one could flee his whims. And he reshaped that private space into a realm entirely of his own making. 2. El Cuartito, the little cabinet of secrets. Hidden within the royal palace of Madrid was a room known only to a select few servants. Its official name sounded harmless: El Cuartito, the little cabinet. But its purpose was far from innocent. Inside, Ferdinand stored one of the most controversial private collections in Europe: suggestive French illustrations, Italian romantic art, English satirical prints with risque themes, provocative caricatures, Asian scrolls depicting scenes of passion. Books forbidden across much of the continent, mirrors lined the walls. The furniture was soft, low, and arranged for unconventional comfort. Scents and oils filled the air. Foreign diplomats were stunned. Some mentioned the king's collection in confidential reports, describing it as more extreme than anything they had seen in public entertainment houses. Ferdinand spent long hours in this room, laughing, breathing heavily, commenting on images, mimicking scenarios, inventing fantasies inspired by what he saw. It wasn't just indulgence, it was dominance. This room was his private throne, a throne built not from gold but from obsession. Failing body, a consuming mind. By his 30s, Ferdinand VII's health was collapsing. He was described as extremely overweight, suffering from severe gout, struggling with chronic dysfunction, swollen by fluid retention, often unable to control bodily functions, visibly deformed by illness. Some ambassadors wrote that he was an inflated body, driven by cravings he could never satisfy. And the more his body failed him, the more intense and unreasonable his demands became. It was as if every physical weakness deepened his need to assert dominance in his private life. His urges were not about romance, they were psychological. He wasn't searching for pleasure. He was searching for proof that he still held power, still commanded respect, still mattered. Demore the queen's captives of the bedchamber. Ferdinand married 4 times. None of his queens ever spoke of affection, kindness, warmth, genuine closeness, but all left behind the same legacy: fear. Each queen was pushed into humiliating routines, many inspired by what Ferdinand saw in El Cuartito. He demanded unusual role play, degrading reenactments, forced scenes, childish and irrational scenarios, long sessions even when the queens were sick or exhausted. These women were not partners. They were performers trapped inside the king's imagination, captive to his compulsions, their bodies used to soothe the injuries of his ego. Some queens reportedly fainted. Some developed anxiety-related conditions. Some begged their ladies-in-waiting for support. None received it. 5. Intimacy as public theater. Ferdinand's obsessions did not always stay behind closed doors. Sometimes he summoned dancers, actresses, servants, lower-ranking noblewomen, not for secret encounters but for public demonstrations. He forced them to entertain him while the court watched in paralyzed silence, afraid to look, afraid to speak, afraid to anger the king. Witnesses describe these moments as a grotesque theater performed by unwilling participants. For Ferdinand, this had nothing to do with pleasure. It was strategy. In front of ministers and generals, he showcased his control over others, turning private acts into a display of absolute authority. Next, the final obsession, producing an heir. As he aged, Ferdinand developed one final fixation: he must have a son. But his severe health problems and dysfunction made this nearly impossible. Still, he demanded solutions. Solutions his doctors dreaded. Royal physicians were forced to prepare strange remedies, construct wooden instruments, attempt humiliating medical procedures, supervise bizarre rituals in the royal bedroom. They described these sessions in coded letters, terrified that honesty would cost them their careers or their lives. Then the impossible happened. His 4th wife, Maria Cristina, became pregnant. Then pregnant again. Ferdinand celebrated as though reborn, but his failing body could not endure the strain. He died shortly after in 1833. To some, Ferdinand VII was a tyrant, a political disaster, a destroyer of nations, a monster of incompetence. But his darkest legacy was private, because inside those hidden chambers, in those whispered nights, in the nightmares of queens and servants, Ferdinand VII revealed who he truly was: a man twisted by humiliation, consumed by desire for control, and determined to rule at least one kingdom completely. The king's final descent, a body collapsing before the throne. By the final decade of his reign, Ferdinand VII no longer resembled a king, nor even a healthy man. He had become a living ruin, a crumbling monument of flesh, a reminder that corruption, whether of power or of the body, never stops halfway. This chapter follows the disturbing final years of a monarch many once called the most degenerate king in Europe, as his physical decline mirrored the decline of Spain itself. When a monarch carried like a corpse, it began slowly: a swollen ankle, difficulty climbing stairs, a trembling hand. But soon, Ferdinand's condition deteriorated with terrifying speed. He suffered from severe gout, circulatory failure, chronic infected sores. uncontrollable weight gain and pain so intense that even light pressure made him cry out. Witnesses described how he was transported through the palace, carried by several servants, wrapped in cloth to keep his body stabilized, his legs purple and distended, his breathing thick and unstable. A foreign diplomat wrote, "He no longer walks. He is moved from room to room like a lifeless bundle that still insists on issuing commands." At state ceremonies, he appeared like a collapsing figure positioned on a throne. Yet the weaker his body became, the more desperately he clung to authority and to the private obsessions that had ruled his life. To the nightmares of the royal bedroom, illness did not diminish Ferdinand's obsessions. In truth, it intensified them. His bedchamber became a place of fevered hallucinations, intrusive medical treatments, irrational demands, and scenes that blurred suffering with denial. Doctors entered wearing gloves and masks. Priests lingered nearby, unsure whether to offer comfort or prepare last rites. Even as his mind drifted in and out of coherence, Ferdinand still gave orders to bring him his special books, to summon attendants he trusted, to adjust the room for certain visits, to position mirrors so he could feel present, to reenact fragments of old fantasies despite his failing strength. Sometimes he collapsed mid-gesture. Sometimes he wept uncontrollably. Sometimes he shouted at invisible figures no one else perceived. But he never stopped trying. His rituals no longer served pleasure. They served refusal. A king trying to outshout death by repeating the habits of life. Let the nation wait. Bring me the queen. Ferdinand's fourth wife, Maria Cristina, became the unwilling center of his final instability. She was young, fearful, pregnant, and forced to remain constantly available to a man whose body was deteriorating while his expectations remained unchanged. Even ministers whispered about her misery. Some nights she waited in the corridor, silently crying, until the physician signaled that it was safe to approach. Inside she would find a sweating, swollen king wrapped in bandages, shaking with fever, demanding affection he barely understood in his delirium. But Maria Cristina endured everything because she knew one thing: the future of Spain depended on her producing an heir. If she succeeded, she could secure her daughter's right to the throne. If she failed, Ferdinand's volatile brother, Don Carlos, would take power and plunge the nation into chaos. So she stayed, she obeyed. She survived the suffocating demands of a dying tyrant. While Ferdinand wasted away in his private chambers, Spain itself was disintegrating. Famine spread across cities. Corruption infected every ministry. The war for independence in the colonies had been lost. Inflation destroyed the economy, and guerrilla groups threatened rebellion. The king's personal obsessions had diverted attention, money, power, and stability for years. And now, as he decayed, the country decayed with him. A British envoy wrote, "When the king's body fails completely, Spain will fail with it." He was nearly right. In 1833, Ferdinand suffered a final catastrophic health crisis. According to doctors, his legs became black, cold, twice their normal size, swollen with infected fluid, and emitting a foul odor that no perfume could mask. He could no longer swallow solid food. He drifted in and out of fever dreams. He mumbled the names of dead relatives. He sometimes begged servants to kill him. Other times he declared himself immortal. And through it all, he demanded to be treated as a king, to be dressed, bathed, shaved, perfumed, and positioned in bed as if he were still receiving visitors. The courtiers obeyed in horror, because in Spain, disobeying the king, even a dying one, meant death. On the night of September 28, 1833, Ferdinand VII's breath grew shallow. Maria Cristina sat by his bedside, one hand on her pregnant belly, the other trembling in fear and relief. Priests performed the last rites. Doctors whispered that the king was already unconscious. But then in his final moments, Ferdinand opened his eyes. Witnesses claimed he tried to speak, but no words came. Only a faint, wet exhale that sounded like a sigh of defeat. At 2:45 a.m., the monarch who had humiliated Spain, tormented queens and lived through scandal and decay, finally died. The room fell silent. One priest murmured, "The nightmare is over." But it wasn't, because Ferdinand VII left behind a daughter too young to rule, a widow despised by nobles, and a kingdom about to explode. His dark pleasures had shaped his life. His death would shape the future. History has judged many kings harshly. It has condemned tyrants for their massacres, emperors for their wars, and monarchs for leading nations into ruin. But Ferdinand VII stands in a category of his own, not because he was the bloodiest, not because he was the strongest, not because he was the most cunning, but because he destroyed a nation not through ambition, but through weakness, not through conquest, but through corruption, not through brilliance, but through a kind of moral decomposition that spread from the throne into every corner of Spain. For more than 2 decades, the country lived under the rule of a man whose darkest impulses were not a secret to those around him, a man whose private obsessions shaped political decisions, whose paranoia shaped alliances, and whose body itself became a metaphor for the rotting kingdom he controlled. When Ferdinand died, Spain did not breathe a sigh of relief. It collapsed, because the king's true legacy was not a dynasty, nor a vision, nor a new order. It was chaos. He left behind a succession crisis that tore the country in two, an infant heir too fragile to rule, an ambitious widow hated by the aristocracy, a furious brother whose supporters were ready for war, and a nation exhausted, hungry, and angry. The Carlist Wars, 3 bloody civil wars spanning nearly a century, began as a direct result of his failures. Entire regions were devastated. Thousands died. Families were forced to choose between monarchy and monarchy, between one vision of Spain and another, between the ghost of the old regime and the uncertain promise of the new. Spain would never fully recover from the fracture created by this king, who could barely rule himself. But beyond politics, the true horror of Ferdinand VII's reign lives elsewhere, in the chambers where young queens cried in silence, in the medical reports filled with shame, in the whispers of diplomats disgusted by what they witnessed, in the diaries of ministers who saw disease, cruelty, and humiliation slowly replace governance, reason, and dignity. This was the king's private kingdom, a place where desire rotted into compulsion, where power was reduced to physical dominance, where the monarch's fantasies mattered more than treaties, armies, or hunger in the streets. A king obsessed with control lost control of everything. A king addicted to humiliation became an object of pity and disgust. A king terrified of death died screaming into the void. He wanted to be feared. He wanted to be adored. He wanted to be remembered. And he was, but not the way he hoped. To read the lesson of a ruined king. What remains of Ferdinand VII today? Not monuments, not victories, not reforms, not triumphs. What remains is a warning about leaders who rule for themselves, not for their people. A warning about men who confuse desire with destiny and authority with ownership. A warning about the corruption that begins in private rooms, but ends by consuming entire nations. A warning about what happens when a throne becomes a mirror for one man's obsessions, instead of a foundation for millions of lives. Ferdinand VII did not simply fail as a king. He failed as a human being entrusted with power. His reign teaches us that evil does not always come in the form of warriors or tyrants with iron fists. Sometimes it comes in the form of weakness allowed to rule, decadence left unchecked, cruelty disguised as tradition, and a monarchy transformed into a theater for one man's darkness. His shadow outlived him. For decades, Spain remained fractured, suspicious, wounded, its future shaped by the chaos he left behind. Even now, nearly 2 centuries later, historians speak his name with a mixture of disbelief and dread. He is remembered as the king who destroyed an empire, the king who let his country burn, the most perverted king in Europe's history, not because of one scandal or one act of cruelty or one political failure, but because his entire reign was a slow collapse, a long, dark fall that dragged a nation down with him. The king is gone. The shadow remains.